Evil has returned.
Oh, we're back at last. It's not quite an elite specialization reveal, but today we did get a teaser. Teaser Mondays have returned, and what do you know? It's Shiro Tagachi. Okay, hello everybody, welcome to another video. So today we are going to talk about Shiro. This is going to be the final core specialization for the Revenant. It's a real shame they're revealing this to us now, just after the Revenant beta. You know, it would have been really nice to have that beta with all the stances, but perhaps, as ever, they just weren't finished with it. Today I'm going to talk to you guys a lot about exactly what Shiro can do for us as a Revenant. Of course, this is a very important stance because it's going to be our DPS one, and I'm going to talk a lot about the character himself and throw some lore at you guys. Now, just to warn you, if you have any interest in playing Guild Wars 1 factions, maybe you don't want to listen to me right now, because this is basically the entire story of factions. This legend that we're going to be channeling, honestly, out of all of them, Ventari, yeah, was a pretty big character, but honestly in the first game, not super huge. He was more huge for what he did with the Sylvari between the games. Jarlis, yes, was a pretty big character at the start in Guild Wars Prophecies, and then again at the end in Eye of the North, but wasn't like the entire focus of his respective campaigns. Malix, while really cool, was essentially just a hardcore endgame boss that was shoved into the end of a campaign about someone else, Abaddon. And yes, Glint's important too, but we haven't even had her revealed yet. So far, of all the legends, Shiro has had the most story devoted to him. He had an entire campaign revolving around him as the bad guy, discovering that he was the bad guy, and ultimately putting him in his place. So, I want to share this with you guys. I think factions, while the storytelling of that campaign was not the height of this franchise, I think Nightfall was the height, this still had some incredible depth. So first let's talk about the character, then I'll talk about what he can actually do for us as a Revenant. So here's Shiro's story. Shiro was an assassin, and that may sound like a kind of a name that has very negative connotations to us, but in Cantha, this remote southern continent, it was actually seen as a really positive thing. Assassins were a big part of their culture, and companies would like fairly openly hire prominent assassins. Assassins would sell their services to people to eliminate competition and do kind of dirty work for one another, and it wasn't seen as like the super bad thing. Assassins were actually very much integrated into the world of Cantha, and very good assassins could become famous. Shiro was essentially one such assassin like this. He proved himself as a very ruthless and capable man, and eventually caught the attention of the Emperor in Cantha and became his personal bodyguard. And when I say Shiro was ruthless, I mean he was ruthless. Like, there are depictions of him single-handedly stopping an uprising of thugs, the Amphar thugs, and not only did he kill them all, but he also like decapitated their leader, and I believe like put his head on a pike somewhere. At another point, he saves the Emperor's son from a kidnapping, and he just slaughters everyone in front of the child mercilessly. Like, he was a brutal guy, he had violent tendencies, but he was seated in a culture and an environment where that was kind of seen as okay. And so he became the bodyguard to the Emperor, and he was well loved, well trusted. And then something strange started to happen with him, and as we played through factions in Guild Wars 1, we got these weird cutscenes depicting it, where Shiro starts encountering this fortune teller, this old haggard lady, and she starts getting in his mind, and she starts convincing him that the Emperor is going to kill him.
Ah, I see great things in your future. Yours will be a story told by generations. Your swords will be sought by many.
And at the time in factions, we didn't know the motivations of this woman. It turned out she was actually a servant of Abaddon, who himself had his own plans to break free and was trying to use Shiro as a pawn. But for Shiro, eventually this fortune teller got into his mind and convinced him that during a large ceremony taking place at the Harvest Temple, his life was in great danger and he had to do something about it. He had to kill the Emperor before the Emperor killed him. And so that's kind of the setup. This was 200 years before the Guild Wars 1 and the events of the Factions campaign. So the Harvest Ceremony begins, and they've never been incredibly explicit about the way that the Harvest Ceremony works and the purpose of the Harvest Temple, but it's essentially a ceremony that seemed to happen annually, and it was a time when the goddess Dwayna, the goddess of life, don't forget this was a very human-centric story, all the humans believed in her, and she was still very much interacting with the world at this time, the goddess would kind of lend her magic. She would infuse the Emperor with her presence, and my theory here is that then this would spread throughout the world and provide them perhaps with a rich harvest, a rich bounty, and then, you know, people would prosper over this. And so there's this big ceremony that would happen at the Harvest Temple every year, and Shiro would accompany the Emperor there as he would be channeling Dwayne and this magic, and as his bodyguard would obviously be there to protect the Emperor. But because of the fortune teller, he is correct. He notices that the Emperor is being a bit weird, protocol seems to be in break, and that sets him off, and Shiro ends up killing the Emperor. This entire scene is actually the CGI cutscene that was the trailer for Factions. ArenaNet don't do CGI cutscenes anymore. This was the best one they ever did. The Prophecies one was just like barely related to the ultimate story, but the Factions one is incredible. It shows all these little details and characters that all actually have relevance in the lore and in the story. So, in the middle of this invocation, Shiro kills the Emperor, and using dark magics, he's begun to fall down this path. He absorbs the Emperor's soul, and with it, all of this powerful magic from Dwayne, and he basically goes Super Saiyan. He starts slaughtering everyone. But he is stopped right there at the ceremony. He's stopped by three people, three heroes of Cantha. One of them was a man named Arkham Morris, and the other one's a man named Saint Victor. Now, these were champions of their respective people, the Kurziks of the Echo Valley Forest, and the Luxons of the Jade Sea. And the ironic thing about this is these two men ultimately were the ones that killed Shiro, and these two men wouldn't have even been at the ceremony, wouldn't have even been involved, hadn't even been brought into the Empire if it wasn't for Shiro's own efforts back before he started getting corrupted and falling down this dark path. So that was always a cool little twist. But basically, these guys kill Shiro. They do it with the help of an assassin, another assassin, a woman named Vizu, and this is all stuff you can see in the cutscene. But as he dies, because he's got all of this power within him, Dwayne's power, it's unleashed as he is destroyed in a death whale. And instead of, I guess, bringing much life to these regions, it does the opposite. It petrifies everything, and everyone there is killed. Vizu can shadow step, as the assassins can be very, very fast. The idea of shadow stepping, by the way, is moving through the mists, and of course we have the Revenants, who are big mist communers, and there's some parallels we'll see soon. And she, like, tries to escape. She flees as far as she can, but I believe she's still turned to stone on, like, the edge of the Echo Valley Forest, and everything's frozen. And that causes, like, devastation across the continent, like complete devastation. It almost wipes out the Naga who lived in the Jade Sea, and they end up hating the humans for it. They managed to recover because of a powerful empress of theirs, but even 200 years after this event, the lands that they once lived in, the Jade Sea, are still petrified, and they still hate humanity. Over in the Echo Valley Forest, there are these people, the Wardens, and the Wardens are intelligent. There's actually a lot of reason to believe they could basically just be Sylvari. And the Wardens start to hate the humans as well, because they friggin' destroyed their homeland and turned that place entirely to stone. Other creatures, like previously like peaceful dragons, as the Canthans called them, were flat out corrupted. There's a demon that lives under the Jade Sea called Kanaxai, who starts making humans who digging too deep into the Jade ill and summoning demons of his own, the Oni, around the continent. There's just a lot of mess that occurs from this. And 200 years after that, really, that's where the game begins. Shiro at this point has been dead a long time, and people are kind of moving on from him. But when the game begins, Shiro returns. So how did this happen? Well, this has a lot to do with the way death works in this universe, and in Cantha specifically, there is the idea of the envoys. Now, we've never really heard about this with regards to the other continents. My little theory of this is why we don't really see undead being an issue in Cantha, but we do see random undead wandering around in places like Tyria and Elona. But in Cantha, they have this idea of these envoys. And essentially what happens is the biggest, baddest, worst guys, as punishment, when they are killed, instead of being able to move on to one of the various afterlives, they are cursed to walk the world and shepherd other dead into the afterlife. This is like a bit of a trope, something we see in, I think it's Greek mythology we see this, but essentially they are doing this as a punishment. And Shiro, because he was so bad, became an envoy. And it's kind of interesting to me, actually, that the Revenants are really good at communing with the mists and kind of at one with them, and a big part of Shiro, like his character, is like this struggle with the mists, and the fact that during this long time as an envoy, he couldn't actually go to them himself to the afterlife. I think that's a really cool touch. I'd love if the dialogue actually that he has with us as a Revenant actually touches on that. But here's where Shiro's a little bit different. The other envoys kind of did their duty. Shiro goes rogue. And it's as Shiro is going rogue that the game begins. Shiro doesn't like this punishment, and ultimately, Shiro's whole goal from this point on is to come back to life. And Shiro's a really interesting character, I think, for us to be able to play as Revenants, because Revenants are kind of big communers of the mists, and Shiro, of any character in this franchise, is one who has spent a lot of time darting in and out of life and messing around, and we'll see. So, he's been alive so far in the story, now he's dead, he's in the mist, but that's not enough for him, he wants to come back to life. And so he goes rogue, he stops shepherding souls, and he starts looking at how he can bring himself back to life. And now, wherever he walks, wherever this envoy moves to, he kind of brings death and destruction with him. There's a plague that starts to spread across the land of Kanto. It becomes very, very serious. You can kind of liken these to zombies, essentially, and they were the primary enemies of the factions campaign. You were following, you were seeing where these afflicted were coming from, and ultimately you realized it's because of Shiro. You see his old guild symbol burned into the ground of a temple, and you come to the conclusion that he must be stopped. This involves learning a lot more about the envoys. Shiro was not the only one. At one point, actually, in your pursuit of Shiro, he kills you and all your friends, everyone who's trying to fight back against him. He just straight up kills you in the plot. And this is one of the most exciting moments of Factions for me. The lore series I was doing is currently stalled at this moment. He kills all of you, but you manage to come back to life because the other envoys hate that Shiro's going rogue, and they ultimately, the Shepherds of the Dead, they have control over this, and they just bring you back to life, and they say, alright, look, you're back to life, but now you're in debt to us. We've just saved you here, you have to help us out, you have to help us stop Shiro, and they kind of explain the situation to you. So, Shiro's doing kind of two things. One, he's trying to bring himself back to life, but as he moves around, the affliction seems like almost a byproduct of what he's doing, but he's actually creating an army for himself too. He creates these things called Shiroken, which are constructs he has built, and then he like binds a soul to them, and he's kind of building this army of Shiroken. So as you get later on in the story, you fight less afflicted and more Shiroken, and they end up kind of defending him. But then eventually, he finds out how to bring himself back to life, and he needs a couple of things, but most importantly, he needs the blood of the royal family. So Shiro is going to try with his army of Shiroken and afflicted to kill the emperor. Just like he did 200 years ago, and this is kind of the climax of the story. It's revealed that your closest ally, Master Togo, is himself of royal blood, and Shiro doesn't kill the emperor, he kills your dear friend Togo. And not only is Togo now dead, which is very sad, but Shiro, using his blood, can come back to life. And there's a nice thing about this plot. One of my favourite things about the Factions plot is something really relatable to think of just a man that wants to come back to life. He wants his life back, especially considering he was manipulated by the fortune teller. But make no mistake, he's deranged. He's an evil guy, okay? He was through and through an evil, big badass. And so now he's fully back to life. And you, the heroes, are tasked with stopping him. But here's the catch. Here's the cool part. Now that he's back to life, you can kill him and be done with it for once and for all. So that's the end of Factions. The final mission is to defeat Shiro. That will have been a lot of the footage you're seeing in the background there. And he's got a lot of powerful abilities. He's there alone. He doesn't have any allies. It's you versus him. And of course, ultimately, you're successful and everybody praises you. And that's the end of the campaign. That's not it for Shiro, though. Now he's dead again. Now what happens to him? Well, he doesn't become an envoy. He is sent to the worst hell imaginable. He is sent to the realm of torment. And what do you know, the realm of torment turns out to be just where Abaddon is imprisoned, and Abaddon is the big bad guy of the next campaign. And so in the next campaign, once you actually go to the realm of torment yourself, Abaddon being the orchestrator of all of this, initially with the fortune teller, you will find Shiro in one of the most climactic, difficult missions of that entire campaign, the Nightfall campaign. You will find Shiro along with the big bad boss from Prophecies, which came before Factions, and you have to fight them together. And so Shiro is still actually at work and still has power and is manipulating things after you defeat him at the end of Factions. When you kill him at the end of Nightfall, though, we have no word on what happens to him since. 250 years pass, a little bit more, and what do you know? Apparently Ritlock has learned how to commune with him and is riding shotgun with this guy, and we're going to be able to have conversations with him and stuff. How cool is that? Like, honestly, Shiro is a fantastic choice for them to have chosen, and I'm very, very happy and curious to see what the kind of dialogue he'll have with us. Will he tell us more about the envoys? The envoys are a really, really fascinating topic to me. I'd love to know what's going on with them, like in this timescale. You know, to hear him be petulant and annoyed about what had happened before would just be fantastic. Or even if he's just mad, being able to control him and tell him, shut up, Shiro, heal me, and then he's forced to, would just be so brilliant. Alright, so that's the story stuff out of the way. Let's talk mechanics. The story, of course, does feed into the mechanics, and I think, you know, the fact that Shiro made Shiroken, that was a big part of him, could mean that there's cause to believe that the Revenant channeling Shiro might get something similar, some kind of like Shirokin ally, though I sort of doubt that. But don't forget, they're going to have some kind of an upkeep skill. Don't summon kind of abilities work very well as upkeep skills, though we haven't seen any of them on any of the Revenant specializations just yet. So what else could he do? Well, I want to look at the final boss fight with him, because there he's got a lot of very potent skills. You'll see the depth of the skill and the combat system in Guild Wars 1, and you'll be shocked at how different it was to Guild Wars 2. Let's run through his abilities, okay? And those of you who are fans of the first game will probably smile at a few of these. Alright, so his first ability was something called Battle Scars, and this is just a stance he toggles onto himself, and it means whenever he's attacking, he doesn't just do damage to you, but he steals life from you. So don't forget, he's kind of 1 versus 8, because they were 8-man instances. So the way he kind of sustains himself is he's constantly stealing life. In fact, lifesteal was a huge part of Shiro. He was mechanically kind of an assassin, but he used a warrior kind of skill types and animations and stuff, so he's kind of like a mix between the two. But so he is doing a lot of lifesteal, and I would very much expect the Revenant to get a lot of lifestealy stuff also when they channel this stance. So he had Battle Scars. That was like a really common thing. You'd see him popping on himself. He had another really interesting ability called Echoing Banishment, and what this would do is it would target one of the members of your party. If you went in like solo with just AI, it wouldn't happen, but if you went with like 8 other humans, it would target one of the people in your party, and he would banish you to the mist. Like, mechanically it didn't work this way. The idea was he was actually sending you to the mists. And so this obviously is a huge thing that we could see with the Revenant as well, because the Revenants are so in tune with the mists also, just as Shiro at one point was, it seems. The way this mechanically worked was he'd banish you from the battlefield, replace you with the spirit, and if your allies killed the spirit, then you'd get snapped back. Or you could wander through the mists yourself to, like, fighting enemies alone to find your way out and actually break out on your own. So that was another one of his skills, really iconic skill for him. Next one was Meditation of the Reaper. How dervishy does that sound? And don't forget that the Revenant, yes, is kind of ritualist inspired, but it's also got a lot of dervish influence, and hell, we saw dervish skill icons being data mined just quite recently. So Meditation of the Reaper did this. It meant that he would stop and kind of float there with his legs crossed, and he wouldn't fight back. But while he was doing this, he kind of had a huge amount of extra health available to him, and you had to basically do 500 damage to him, which is a lot of damage in Guild Wars 1's terms. And once you did 500 damage to him, he would break out of the stance. But here's the catch: for every second he was in the stance before you managed to do that 500 damage to him, he would steal life from everyone around you. So if it took your team ages to break him out of Meditation of the Reaper, he would suddenly just nuke your entire team, do tons of damage to everyone, possibly killing a load of you if you have death penalty and you've been dying a lot before, and he'd heal himself up massively as well. And so he'd toggle into this every now and then. You just basically had to hit him really, really hard, really, really fast, otherwise you would really suffer for yourself. This meant that really tanky teams couldn't like deal with him. The next ability he had was Reposting Shadows. And what this was essentially, if you attacked him, imagine you're a ranger, okay, and you attack him, he counters physical attacks he gets hit by blinking to that person. So if I'm stood at 1200 range and I shoot him, he blinks right next to me, and then he tries to attack me. If his attack lands, it does a lot of damage, and then he can instantly use it again. It has no cooldown. And then someone else could attack him. So what you'd see is Shiro would be like blinking all over the place, like attacking people. But if you were able to blind him or interrupt that counter attack itself, he'd go on cooldown, and then you could have some rest from that. And this, of course, will sound very familiar to you guys, because on the original stream we saw for the Revenant it wasn't even for the Revenant, it was when they're showing off adventures and there was a Revenant in the background. They were using a sword, and they were using a kind of a very similar ability to this. I wouldn't be surprised if it was very much called Reposting Shadows. So you don't forget, we're getting a weapon here, and we're going to be getting the stance. So the sword skills could be like Shiro inspired as much as the utility skills are going to be. Right, so that was Reposting Shadows, and last of all, we have Impossible Odds. This is the one most people remember. Impossible Odds was this crazy ability he would only activate when he got really low, 25% health or less, okay? And when he triggers Impossible Odds, he would cleanse himself of all hexes, okay? So hexes were kind of like very specific conditions. He would also, every time he landed an attack, he would transfer all conditions that were on him onto his target. So he had crazy, like, he cleared all of his hexes, and he had crazy condi damage and cleanse for himself. and it made his attacks all AoE, so if you were balled up, like even remotely, he'd just be attacking one of you, and he'd hit like all of the targets in the area, and it meant that every time he attacked, instead of attacking once, he'd attack twice. And because Shiro is such a high level and an assassin, he gets this extra mechanic called double strike, and double strikes mean that instead, whenever he attacks twice, he actually attacks 4 times, because he attacks the first time, and he does a double strike, and then he attacks the second time, and he does a double strike. So essentially, when he toggled impossible odds, he became this unstoppable, beastly thing that would just do devastating AoE damage, was almost unstoppable. And don't forget that he does a ton of life steal as well while he's at it. So there were ways to counter this. You could like hex him and quickly nuke him down after he did the initial cleanse, and there were ways eventually to choose the fire and stuff, but he was a really formidable opponent. And impossible odds is the most iconic skill of all of those I just told you guys about, and I would be very shocked if we don't get like some kind of impossible odds style ability for the Revenant. In fact, I'll just be very sad if we don't. Alright, so that's what he did. What can we say then about the Revenant? Well, any of these abilities, the various interpretations of them could reappear. I also wouldn't be surprised to see some story-related ones, like something to do with the Jade Wind, like some kind of Jade Wind whale stun ability that he might have, as well as perhaps this Shiroken thing, something to do with the Affliction, the Plague. It's already very clear that this is going to be our kind of DPS stance kind of character. We know that the trait line itself is going to be, or the specialization line is going to be called Devastation. We know there's a trait there that's going to be boosting ferocity to yourself and all allies around you. And also, it seems very likely that it's going to be a dual-wielding sword profession. So, in Guild Wars 1, Shiro was an assassin, so he actually used daggers. But his daggers were huge. They were like the biggest daggers in the game for a long time. They were essentially just swords. He was dual-wielding swords. And actually, my favorite green skin, after you killed him, you could collect like a special reward at the very end of the campaign, and the special reward that was like my favorite ever was the dagger skin that was basically dual wielding swords. Like that stuff was amazing. You have to remember Guild Wars 1 kind of had a lot more muted realistic skins, so to have like these huge daggers was just freaking awesome, and they had like life steal on them and stuff. So it seems that Revenant will probably get in dual wield swords, would be my speculation there. And don't forget that if he then gets that does then combo into existing weapons. That also means we have available to us the sword axe combo or the mace sword combo for kind of DPS Condi-ish hybrids there. I do very much like the mace main hand, so mace sword might be really cool. And last of all to think of are these kind of dervish scythe skill icons that Shaman was mining just the other day. But, you know, the whole scythe thing, really we just get that with staves, right? And then we skin it over Final Rest. So yeah, there you go, guys. That is Shiro. That's a bit of story about him. That's what these reveals could be showing us this week. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I know it was quite an exhaustive look. Let me know if you're enthused, and if you are even slightly tempted from hearing everything I've just said to play Guild Wars 1 over it, I would say absolutely go for it, because the gameplay is very different, but there's a lot of really, really cool stuff in there once you get used to the way it works, especially if you've got a friend too. It should be really cool. But yeah, cheers guys, thanks so much for watching. Let me know if you think I missed anything, and I'll see you tomorrow.
Shut your mouth, old fool.